All right, welcome back. So this section has to do with forms. We'll talk about a couple of components that all have to do with getting user input. We'll make pretty nice looking forms, and we have to kind of get this out of the way now because other things we're going to talk about, for example, nav bars, often there's a little form in a nav bar, maybe a search input or a sign in, email, password, or something like that, that is part of a nav bar. So we have to do this first. Forms are obviously very important. I will warn you though, even though we're going to make nice looking forms, we still don't know, or we haven't talked about the grid system. So our forms are going to take up the entire screen. We haven't talked about how you position things, how you make, move something to the left or the right, or have it be 50% of the screen on a certain size and 100% of the screen on a different size. So that will come once we get to the grid system. So in this section, we're just learning the components, we're making forms, but they're going to be a bit large. So to find the documentation, well, we go to documentation, components, and then forms right here. And there's a lot here if you look down the side. So I'm breaking this up into a couple of videos. In this video, we're talking about a couple of important classes. One called form control, another called form group, and then a couple special form controls for different types of inputs like a file input. We'll talk about how to make larger and smaller inputs. And then also we're going to talk about making things read only. So the stuff that we're not getting to just yet, because we have to talk about the grid system, is something like this form here, where if you notice the layout, email and password are together, city, state, zip are together on a single row. But then as we shrink down, eventually, they all go to their own rows. So that sort of thing we're not going to have control over just yet. We're just going to make these large forms that go all the way across. Okay, so let's start with the very basics. The first thing you need to understand is that to get Bootstrap to style your inputs, you need to use the form control class, form-control. So whatever type of input you're using, almost all of them, if you just give form control as a class, it will make it look nicer. Inputs, selects, text areas, multiple types of inputs, email, password, all of that, you give it form control and it will look nice. So that's the first thing. And I have, of course, over here, a new file, empty, just a container. It has Bootstrap included. And I'm just going to put an H1 in here just to give me some room at the top of the page. And I'll just say form controls. Okay, and I have it open with live server. And I'm actually going to shrink this down. We don't need it to be very large. And the first thing I'll do, make this a bit larger again, is add a form. And we don't have to do any classes or any styling to the form itself. And I'm going to begin by adding a simple input. And let's do input type equals, email. And I'm going to leave this name and ID blank for now. I'll get rid of name. But let's just look at it on its own. Let's give it a placeholder. Just say, or maybe enter your email. Okay, so this is the default styling without Bootstrap. Now if I give it class equals form control, form-control, and I save, it looks like this now. Oh, and I misspelled placeholder. There we go. So it already looks a lot better. Now the standard thing that we should do, best practice, is to also include a label. And in this label, I'll just say something like email address. But also along with that, if you're not familiar with labels, it's best to include the for attribute, and that needs to match the ID on a given input. So I'm going to give this a for, I'm just going to call it email. Then I need to give the input the same ID, which is email. So this is really for accessibility reasons. It associates this label that explains what's going on here with the input. Also, it allows us to click, or if we weren't using a mouse, if we were tabbing or something, it allows us to find the correct input based off of the label up here. If I didn't have that, if I got rid of the for, it doesn't work. If I click here, nothing happens. Okay, so that's not really a Bootstrap thing. That's just in general. And that's form control on an email input like this. It's going to bother me that this is lowercase. I like my placeholders uppercase. The other things we can do, of course, there's many other types of inputs. You could do the same thing, for a password. So I'm going to just duplicate this and do type equals password. And then I'll change the ID and everything. But if I give it a form control class, which it already has, it's still a password input, but it looks nice. And it matches what we have above. You might notice already, though, that there's a problem here, which has to do with the spacing. It's kind of ugly. We could just go add padding ourselves. There's actually a class that you can use called form group. So if we go on the docs, scroll down somewhere, I should make this full screen. You'll see that somewhere, here we go, form group. Form group class is the easiest way to add some structure to forms. It provides a flexible class that encourages proper grouping of labels, controls, help text, and form validation messaging. Basically, it's a way of grouping a label with an input, and maybe if there's like a little helper message below, whatever you need to go along with your input, you can group it together. And it does give it some margin bottom. And then later, when we talk about form inline, it also picks up some additional styles. So let's add that now around both of these. I'm going to give them each a form group because they're separate inputs. So it's a div. It doesn't have to be a div, but that's kind of an easy thing to use. Form dash group, and then the same thing down here. And this is sort of standard Bootstrap form, indentation problems. Here we go. And you can see it looks a little bit cleaner. Now I should change this to say enter password or something. I'll just do password. And then I'll change the for to be password as well. And the ID needs to match. Okay. And now I can click on these two, and that's working because of that for attribute on the label. So that's form control. Now another thing we can do for helper text, I like to add a small element with text muted. And then in here we can say, password must be 8 characters or something. And then we get this nice little input or this little text that goes below, and it's grouped in with all of this. Okay, other things that we can do. So if we go back, there are other types of inputs. Of course, this works with type equal text, type equals email, password, but also things like if you wanted to do a select. So the way that we make a select, I'm going to do another form group, which is not mandatory, it's just for spacing. I'll do my label, and then I'll come back and fill it out. We'll do a select, and I'll get rid of name for now and give it a class. Actually, let's do it without form control first so we can see before and after. And inside of the select, I'm going to do a couple of options. And my options, I'm just going to simplify things, will just be numbers, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is a way of quickly doing that in VS Code, generating numbers in a row, consecutive integers. I just don't remember how to do it. So select, and on its own, this is what we get. This is our drop-down, it's not a drop-down technically, it's a select. If I instead come in here and do class equals form dash control, there we go. It looks a lot nicer. So we have this space up here because we have an empty label. So I'm just going to call this select. And it should be specific here. Associate these two with the for and the ID on the input. And that's all there is to making a select. Now another thing that you can do, if you're familiar with a multiple select, it looks like this, where you can select multiple things at once. On a Mac, you hold down Command. On a PC, you hold down Control, and it will select multiple items. So to do one of those, all you have to do, I'm just going to duplicate this entire group. Again, I do that with Shift and Option and down arrow on VS Code on a Mac. So this one, we keep it as form group. We'll call this multi-select as our label, and just do this here. Make sure they match. Keep class form control, but in our select, we just add an attribute called multiple, just like that. And now we have this multi-select. And to be helpful, let's do text muted as a small again and just say hold down Control on a PC or Command on a Mac to select multiple. And that just adds a little helper text. Okay, so now we have form group we've talked about form control. We can also do text area, which you're probably bored of watching me do this. Feel free to fast forward. Form group, do our label, and then we'll do text area, which is slightly different because it's not input type equals text or text area. It's an actual standalone element. So we'll give it an ID of text area, for equals text area. These are not very good names, especially if you have more than one text area. You need to be specific. What is this text area for? But since this is just a demo, it's fine. And I don't want, let's do like 4 rows. And I'll give it class equals form dash control. And there we go. It's our nice text area. Without it, let's see what we're talking about. All right, not very nice looking at all. So there we add form control and it looks a lot better. Next up, we have file inputs. So text equals or type equals file is going to give us a file input by default. There's something slightly different though, and I'll show you. You might think we could just do .form group and then do input type equals file, which is, where are you? Right there. And give it a class equals form control. Let's just see what it looks like without form control, by the way. So this is the default. If we do class equals form control, it sort of works, except it's very ugly. It's giving like the standard style that it does for all of these other inputs. It doesn't look very nice on this file input. So there's a different class called form control dash file. And if we save, it looks like this. So it gets rid of that border. It just formats things a little bit nicer. There's another way of doing a file input I'm going to show you in a separate video when we talk about custom file controls or form controls, excuse me. That's coming up, but this is one way, form-control-file. And I'll add in a label. I'll fast forward. There we go. We have a label associated with it. And the last type of input I'll talk about is a range input. It's on here somewhere. There we go. And just to speed this up, I'm just going to copy it, show you what it looks like. So form group, same thing, except you give it a class of form-control-range, type equals range, and this is what we get, this little range input here. So there's also a custom version I'll show you later in the section. All right, one other thing we'll talk about is sizing. So as you can see here, you can change the size of these forms, or the form controls, using additional classes, form control large and form control small, just like you would with a button. And so you still have to add form-control. Then in addition, you can add large. So let's take our email from up top and duplicate it down here. And then let's just add in here, we'll say form control large. And we can keep it all as email, although we should give it a different ID to be specific and so that the label still works, large email. And then we do form control, and then form control -LG to make it large. And then here's our large email. And then we can do the same thing to make one small. So form control -SM, and then I'll do small email, just to make these match. Change our label. And here's our small form control, our large form control. And, something that comes up a lot, you would want a button at the end. So you can do input submit. There you are. And we give it a value of, let's just say submit, and then a class. If we just save it as it is, it's a default button. There's no fancy form button. We just do a regular Bootstrap button. BTN, large, I don't know, primary. And there we go. One last quick thing, we can disable inputs or make them read-only by giving the attribute, where are you on here? Read-only. It will look, it's easier to see on full screen. You give the attribute read-only right here, and that makes one of the inputs read-only. So if I gave this small email the attribute read-only, and I save, now it's read-only. I can't enter my email here, no matter how hard I try. Now, why you would do that for email, you probably wouldn't, but it's possible. Okay, so those are the basics of creating a form. So we don't have to do anything fancy for the form itself. It's just a matter of form-control on almost everything we saw, except there is a special case for file and for range. Form control range, form control file. We could do sizing with form control -small and large. And then the other big thing we saw was form group, which is just a way of grouping content together. One, it gives it space, but also it just groups your logical sort of form components together. A label, a select, and a small in this case. We put them in a group. All right, moving on.